New Testament reading is the end of the sequence we think of as the little apocalypse or the judgment speech of Jesus. It begins at chapter 25 in the Gospel of Matthew, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, naked and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Your pastor is a Christian Universalist. We might as well get that out of the way right at the beginning. I only recently learned that there was a name for my belief system, which lies within the bounds of Presbyterianism, so you can relax about that. There are lots of Presbyterian Christian Universalists. I'm one. Christian Universalism consists in this: I believe that there is a sound scriptural basis, a sound foundation that tells us that at the end of all things, God will renew the whole world and everything and everyone in it. God will restore every human being to right relationship with God and will heal us all completely. God will gather us in, the faith-filled and the doubt-driven, the angry and the joyful, the lovers and the leavers, the good, the bad, and everything in between, the sheep and the goats. So as you can imagine, today's passage from Matthew's Gospel puts me in a little bit of a conundrum. And that's ironic because about 20 years ago or so, I decided this was my absolutely favorite passage in all the New Testament. I've since learned that I have lots of favorites. I love this passage, and I'll tell you why. It's going to take a little time. We're at the end of chapter 25, which is the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end of Jesus' ministry. These are Jesus' last words of public preaching, public proclamation in the temple. The past 2 Sundays have been given over to the parables leading up to this, the stay awake parables, the keep watch parables. Then Jesus tells this story, which is more a tale of judgment than a parable. After this, Jesus says to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." So the last thing Jesus wants to tell the people is how the Son of Man, at the ending of the ending, will judge the nations. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, Jesus begins, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people, one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Here's the Son of Man, that term, which sounds so mysterious to us, but which really, literally, in both Hebrew and Greek, literally means the mortal one, because that person's father was a mortal, and that person's father, and so on. But this mortal one is also somehow the judge of all mortals. And he comes in glory with this angelic retinue and sits upon a throne, and now he is also the shepherd dividing the flocks of the nations. Jesus, the Son of Man. Jesus, the judge. Jesus, the king. Jesus, the shepherd. And as the tale unfolds, something surprising happens. The Son of Man tells those on his right, the right being in Scripture symbolic of power and favor. He tells them they are blessed by God, and they are to enter the kingdom prepared for them from the foundation of the world. This is because they cared for him. When he was hungry, they fed him. When he was thirsty, they gave him something to drink. When he was a stranger, and in the Bible, stranger means foreigner or immigrant, they welcomed him. When he was naked, they clothed him. When he was sick, they cared for him. When he was in prison, they visited him. This is all very surprising to the sheep. They don't remember, and they ask when all this happened. Eugene Peterson paraphrases it this way, what Jesus' response is. I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me. We meet God in the place we least expect. We find God in the poor, the hungry, in the lost, the lonely, in the alien, the immigrant, in the suffering, the prisoner. We find God there, and we have an opportunity to open ourselves to that encounter. We have a chance to meet God there, to know the Holy One. This is why I fell in love with this passage so many years ago. Completely absent from this tale of judgment is one single word about the ways we usually divide ourselves as Christians. Jesus does not say, enter into the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, for when someone doubted the virgin birth, you corrected them. When someone told you they were gay, you reminded them how sinful they were. When someone told you women could preach, you told them they had rejected me. Completely missing from this scene of judgment is any notion that what we believe about God enters into the equation. It's just not there. This is why I fell in love with this passage. It is 100% about reaching out in healing, loving, helping ways to those who need it. And it is 0% about thought policing or faith measuring, or my personal favorite sin, who is right. But alas, this is also a big problem for me, Presbyterian, Christian, Universalist that I am, because the poor goats. Let me tell you what happened at Bible study on Monday. Monday evening, we read this passage, and we did it like we always do. One person reads a verse, and we go around the room reading the verses until the passage is done. And we happened to read this passage out of coincidence. We started the Gospel of Matthew last Advent, and we're finishing it up now. And do you know what happened immediately after our finishing reading this passage? People started testifying on behalf of goats. People started saying, but you know, goats are so smart, and they're so interesting. And you can get goat cheese from goats. Did you know that? And one person talked about going to a goat farm and how a goat promptly kissed her. And that was good to her. She thought that was good. There was some distress expressed at the fate assigned to the goats in this parable. The eternal fire reserved for the devil and his angels. What did goats ever do to deserve this? Of course, I don't have to tell you that goats and sheep are metaphors in this story, in this passage. They're stand-ins for people, for nations, for whole communities, and the things that they have prioritized or not prioritized. I was struggling with this question this week because I could not for the life of me figure out why goats would be associated with these behaviors. Even metaphorically speaking, I wondered whether there were any superstitions dating to Jesus' day about goats, or whether people actually viewed them negatively at that time. I found my answer. I found what was probably the biblical basis for this story of Jesus's. It's Leviticus chapter 16, and most of Leviticus is dedicated to worship in the temple, offering sacrifices, the temple appointments, and so forth. In chapter 16 of Leviticus, you have the description of the ritual of the scapegoat. It occurs in the context of the Day of Atonement. Aaron the priest is directed to bring 2 goats, one for the Lord to be sacrificed and then burned on the altar, and another to be the scapegoat, which in Hebrew means literally the goat of departure. After the sacrifices are offered, the ritual of the scapegoat begins. And I'm reading from Leviticus now. Then Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat and sending it away into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. The goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. We know what a scapegoat is. Well, we have a couple of ideas of what a scapegoat is around here. Many of us have experienced it as a concept we learned about in regards to addiction and families that are suffering addiction. Often one person in a family suffering from addiction is identified as the scapegoat because their anger, their acts of defiance, and their behavior is never good enough, and it serves as the repository for the whole family's sickness. And they are sent off into the figurative wilderness, considered beyond the family's ability to help. And meanwhile, the addiction continues. Organizations such as churches sometimes do the same thing. So do societies. Jesus' list of the people who have been ignored or neglected by the so-called goats in our passage, the hungry, the thirsty, the immigrant, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned. This list bears a striking resemblance to many who are, in effect, our own modern-day scapegoats. The people we call welfare queens, the people imprisoned for life for minor drug offenses who we would rather warehouse than actually help to find skills or employment, the people labeled terrorists en masse because of the country they're from or the religion they practice. What if Jesus is telling this story because scapegoating is what we do to the least of God's children? What if Jesus tells us that the Son of Man's judgment upon those who have turned away from their brothers and sisters in need is actually designed to say, this is what it feels like? To say to those who have failed to care for their fellow men, women, and children, now you are the scapegoat. The scapegoat ritual was deadly serious. It took place on the Day of Atonement at the time of temple worship. An animal was chosen to bear the sins of the entire people off into the wilderness. But what is Jesus doing here? I can never read this passage without recalling the way it is portrayed in the movie Godspell. Godspells. Anybody seen this movie? I have a feeling quite a few of us. Godspell tells the story of the gospel in a contemporary medium. At the beginning of the movie, people are going about their normal day as workers in various jobs in a large, busy city. There's a waitress. There's a guy wheeling a rack of clothing down a busy street. There's a cab driver. But then they hear the sound of the shofar, the ancient instrument fashioned from a ram's horn, as it happens, which is used on the Day of Atonement. They walk away from their adult responsibilities and roles and follow Jesus, who dresses them up as if they were children at play and paints colorful symbols on their faces. When Jesus tells the tale of the sheep and the goats in Godspell, it is told to comic effect. The sheep clap, delighted that they are being honored. The goats grimace and moan like little kids being told they can't have the last cookie. The goats watch as Jesus and the sheep go off happy together. And then, of course, Jesus and the sheep come back and they welcome the goats back into the fold and the fun. They were never really being sent to the eternal fire. They just needed to learn this lesson well. I can't help wondering whether that is exactly what Jesus was doing. Was Jesus telling a story that would make his listeners giggle and roll their eyes? Was Jesus lovingly exaggerating like a good teacher telling a memorable tale? Jesus, the Son of Man. Jesus, the Judge. Jesus, the Shepherd. Jesus, the King. Jesus, the Rabbi, teacher. And perhaps most importantly, Jesus, the hungry. Jesus, the thirsty. Jesus, the immigrant. Jesus, the naked. Jesus, the sick. Jesus, the prisoner. Jesus tells this story of the end of the beginning. Look for me, he says. Even if you think I am dead and buried, look for me in those who are struggling and suffering and cast out and isolated. There you will find me. And then help me, welcome me, love me. Jesus is telling us the solemn truth. Whenever and wherever we do these things for those who are being otherwise ignored or reviled or rejected, we will find him there. Jesus, the storyteller. Jesus, the shepherd. Jesus, the King like no other. Thanks be to God. Amen.